It is a true pleasure to be here with you guys today. My name is Ryan Tillman. I'm here from Southern California. And anytime I get to travel across the country and do this, I truly feel that I'm walking in my purpose. And so when I was talking to Chris about the conference and what we were going to be learning about, I was prompted by a specific story that I was reminded of that I think is going to set the tone for this discussion that we have today. Now, about 2 years ago, there was a situation in my family that really altered the trajectory of where we stand today. See, I'm married to a beautiful wife named Kimberly, and I have 3 beautiful kids. And prior to getting married, I met my wife's father, and he should do as any good father-in-laws do, is mean mug me and give me every reason why I shouldn't have married his daughter. So as I was introduced to my wife's father, it was not the best relationship to say when we first got married. But over time, I started to develop a decent relationship because we had a common thing that we liked to do together, which was golf. So me and my father would start to golf a lot, and once he retired from the U.S. Postal Service, he got a job at the local golf course where he spent most of his time, and so he and I got to have a good relationship with each other. So much so that my wife started to become jealous because I started spending more time with him than I was spending with her. And so as this continued over time, there was a season where we went golfing, and it was right around the time where my wife and her twin sister were celebrating their birthday. So we all went together, we all went out for their birthdays. We went camping with one another, and this was right during the heart of the pandemic. And so when we went camping with one another, everything was going well. About a week later, me and my father-in-law went golfing, and then later on that day, he called me and told me that he wasn't feeling well. And I said, okay, well, let me know if you need anything. I was traveling like I am now. I was actually in the city of Dallas doing a presentation as such. And when I was on my way home, I lost my taste. I was like, oh shoot, lost my smell. I was like, I think I have COVID. So I get home, and as I get home, I'm just there, just quarantining from everybody, staying away from everybody. And my father-in-law calls me and says, hey, can you come over to the house and pick up your mother-in-law? She's sick as well, and she's not doing well. So I showed up to the house, and my father-in-law holding and grasping his chest for air, couldn't breathe. And as I answered the door, I look at him, I'm saying, you okay? He said, yeah, I'm okay, just take mom to the hospital. So I take mom to the hospital, and as I get to the hospital, she walks in, and I stay in the car because we're not allowed in the hospital. She comes out about 2 hours later, and I take her home, and I get my father-in-law some food, and he eats, and I go back to my house. That night, I end up going to sleep because I was super, super tired, and then I wake up the next morning to a missed call from my mother-in-law. So I call her back, and I say, hey, what's going on? She says, hey, Pops had to go to the hospital last night. The ambulance came over here. I called you because we needed some help. And I said, oh, okay, well, what do you need me to do now? She said, just follow with the hospital. So anyways, I follow with the hospital. I go there, and when I go there, they don't allow us in the hospital. My father-in-law at this point in time has still been struggling to breathe, and unbeknownst to us, he had contracted pneumonia. And so they first had him on the breathing machine, and so we were talking to him through text message. He was fully coherent, and he was saying, yeah, he was still struggling, but he was gonna fight. So then about 2 or 3 days later, our father-in-law hits us up, and he's like, hey, they're gonna put me on a BiPAP machine. And now I'm not a medical expert, and I didn't know anything about any type of medical stuff. And so a BiPAP machine was a breathing machine that basically goes over your face. So the breathing machine goes over his face, and he sends us a picture of him. And I mean, me and my wife are just like super sad, but he still had a good attitude about it. So I said, babe, don't worry about it. Everything is gonna be okay. Fast forward another 2 days later, my father-in-law hits us up. He says, man, I didn't sleep that well last night. The doctor is gonna be hitting you up soon. So the doctor hits us up soon. He says, hey, you need to make it to the hospital quickly because we're gonna have to intubate your father-in-law. Now, we didn't want that. This is the last thing we wanted. We were actually trying all these different things. I actually wanted to get the ivermectin and all this other stuff because that's what all the people were saying around us, saying, hey, you should try this, you should try that. So we got some ivermectin. I actually snuck it up to the hospital and put it in his stuff. And then my father-in-law texts us and says, hey, look, they went through my bag and they took everything out. I said, that's interesting. So anyways, I'm getting my wife, getting my mother-in-law, getting my sister-in-law. We hop in the car, we're racing to the hospital, trying to get there before they intubate him. I'm calling people at the hospital saying, hey, look, just keep him away just for a little bit so we can go say hi to him because we hadn't seen him in about a week and a half already. So we get there, and once we get to the hospital, we get up to the floor. I talk to the chaplain. The chaplain lets us in there because there wasn't supposed to be anybody in there. And when we get onto the floor, they had already intubated him. And the text message that my mother-in-law received as we're walking up there said, "Hey, honey, my last living will, if I don't make it through this, is that you would get everything." So my mother-in-law grasped her chest. She's like, doesn't know what to think because she hasn't talked to her husband. And the last text message she receives is, "Hey, my last living wish is that you get everything if I pass away." So finally we make it up to the floor. When we make it up to the floor, he's already intubated and he's asleep. So as this is going on, I'm like grabbing my wife and my mother-in-law. We're praying and stuff like that. I said, "It's gonna be okay. We're gonna get through this." That same night, my wife had a women's retreat for our church in the desert. And I said, "Babe, go be with the women. You need to be there. You've already had this plan. I'll take care of the house." So I get home, and all the other husbands from our church came over to my house because we were trying to watch and wrangle all these kids and keep them all from burning the house down. So we decided to, tag team it because we didn't know what to do since our wives were gone. And as we're there, we get all these kids, and finally we get them to sleep. We're slapping hands. "Hey, great job, guys, great job." We didn't give them too much candy. They go to sleep. I call my wife and say, "Hey, babe, everything is good. The kids are down." She says, "Hey, I just got a message from my mom. It says that," and she said that she has somebody that she knows in the hospital that said, "Pops is actually doing way better. They said he's gotten way more oxygen in a short amount of time that they've ever seen." I said, "That's awesome news, babe." I said, "Enjoy your time and let me know if there's anything I need to do." So I go to sleep, and as I go to sleep, 2:32 in the morning, I get a phone call from the hospital. And I knew at that moment in time that this wasn't gonna be good. My phone rings, and when my phone rings, I answer, and it's a nurse, and he says, "Hey man, unfortunately, your father took a turn for the worse overnight. You need to make it to the hospital as quick as you can because I think he only has a matter of minutes left." So I call now I'm in police mode. Now I'm trying to figure this out because my wife is an hour away in the desert. I got to get her home. My mother-in-law is up the street. She's knocked out, dead asleep. So I'm in police mode trying to coordinate. I call the ladies at the women's retreat. I tell them everything that's going on before they tell my wife because I know the moment she finds out, she's not going to be able to move. So I say, "You need to pack her bags, get her in the car, and then once that's all set, I will give her a call and let her know what's going on." So they do that. I call my wife. I break the news to her. She flies down the freeway, or they drive her back to me. An hour later, I get childcare for my kids so we can go to the hospital. And I get my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, my wife. We all together. We run up to the hospital. And as soon as we get into the hospital floor, we walk up into the IC unit. And the first thing they see is them doing CPR on my father-in-law. Now, if you're a first responder, you've seen CPR done before, and it's a very, very violent act. If you've never experienced CPR, it's not a good sight to see. It's a very traumatizing thing. They've never experienced anything like this. I, unfortunately, as an officer, have seen this many times before. So we get up to the floor, and once we get up to the floor, they're doing the CPR. My mother-in-law, my wife, they're all grabbing and holding on to each other, and the doctor approaches me, and he says, "Hey, look, man, we've been working on your father-in-law for 30 minutes. The moment he said that, I already knew what was coming next because I've seen this happen many and countless times on calls for service. What he's trying to tell me is that, hey, we're gonna stop doing CPR here in a couple minutes." So this goes on. I have to go break the news to my wife and my mother-in-law about what's about to transpire, and they're like, they don't even know what to think at this moment in time. So while this is going on, my sister-in-law is actually FaceTiming my brother-in-law who lives in Miami because he's in the Coast Guard. And as she's FaceTiming my brother-in-law, the doctor walks up next to her and says, hey, you can't be video recording this, in a very rude manner. Started to piss me off. I said, hey, she's not video recording. She's FaceTiming her brother because he can't be here, and this is probably the last chance he's gonna get to see his father. So he goes to do what he does, and then finally, after a couple more minutes, they finally pull the plug on him. My father-in-law was dead, lay dead on a bed right in front of us. Same man I just golfed with 2 weeks before that. So as this is happening, the doctor comes out and he approaches my mother-in-law and he tells my mother-in-law, hey, would you like to go have your last moments with your father or with your husband? She says yes. So she puts on a gown and a robe and she goes in there. And it was the saddest sight to see my mother-in-law hunched over my father-in-law just crying because she didn't know that this was gonna happen 2 weeks later. As she comes out of the room, we all embrace my mother-in-law, we're hugging her, and immediately the doctor comes out and he puts his hands in between all of us and says, hey, you guys gotta separate from each other. Take the gown off. And it was at that moment in time that I realized that I was dealing with an egg. I don't know if the PowerPoint is up, but if you can throw the PowerPoint. It was at that moment in time I realized that I was dealing with an egg. Some of you guys are probably wondering what I mean when I say I'm dealing with an egg. Well, I want to kind of just tell you another brief story, kind of set precedents, and I don't know if this clicker works. There we go. About last year sometime, I had the opportunity of going to a restaurant in Dallas, and I met a guy by the name of Damon West, who just so happened to be a friend of this guy by the name of Dak Prescott. So for all y'all Cowboy fans in the building, I was with Dak Prescott that night. Sorry for y'all that are fans in here. I feel sorry for you guys. So anyways, we're at dinner, and as we're at dinner, I meet Damon, and Damon starts to tell me a story. I'm like, Damon, what brings you here? He says, man, I have a really interesting story. I grew up in northern Texas, had two really great parents, went to college, played football there, and when I graduated there, I went to work on Wall Street. Did a phenomenal job on Wall Street, and one day I found myself extremely tired at work, and so my buddy tells me, meet me in the parking garage, and I'll give you something to pick you up. He goes to the parking garage, and when he goes to the parking garage, they get in a car, and his buddy hands him a clear plastic baggie with a clear substance inside. Damon ingested methamphetamine for the first time in his life. He gets high on life, he goes back, and he works really, really hard. The next day, he crashes, and he goes and asks his buddy for some more dope. Again, he starts his cycle. Next thing you know, Damon finds himself as a habitual drug user. Now Damon starts to break into people's houses, starts to break into people's cars in order to take their stuff, take it to the pawn shop, get more money so that way he can go buy more drugs. This happens over and over again until one day Damon and his brother are sitting in their house, he's strung out, and the door busts down, and when the door busts down, the police show up and they take Damon to jail. Damon goes to jail for conspiracy to commit burglary, conspiracy to commit armed robbery, and all these other things. And so when Damon goes to his trial, he's not even worried about it because he's like, look, I never hurt anybody. I'll probably get a year to 2 years max, not worried about it. Damon's mom is in court. His dad is disappointed. And when he's in there, Damon is found guilty on all charges. Damon gets whisked away to county jail while he's awaiting his sentence. He goes back to the courthouse a few months later in order to get his sentence. And when he's sitting in the courtroom, he's not worried. He tells his mom, I know you're disappointed. Don't worry. I'll probably get a year, 2 years max. It's not going to be that big a deal. I promise I'll beat this case. So Damon is sitting in the courthouse, and as he's sitting in the courthouse, the judge looks over to Damon and he tells Damon, you've now been sentenced to life in prison. So Damon goes back to the county jail where he's to await being transported to state prison because that's where he's going to spend the rest of his life. As he's at county jail, he meets a gentleman in there who's been in and out of the state prison system his whole life. And he starts to have a conversation with the man. And as he starts to have a conversation with the man, the guy is telling Damon, like, bro, you have no idea what's in store for you. Damon's like, what do you mean? He says, when you enter into that prison system, it's going to be like entering into a hot boiling pot of water. Damon's like, man, what do you mean? He's like, man, trust me. The moment you walk in there, they're going to try to sexually assault you. The moment you walk in, they're going to try to get you to join their gang. The moment you walk in there, they're going to try to take your life. Damon's like, man, I'm not ready for any of this. He says, what are my options? He says, you got 3 options if you want to survive, and this is how you're going to come out, one way or the other. He says, option number 1, you can turn into a carrot. Damon's like, what do you mean a carrot? Like, how do we go from talking about prison to talking about food? He says, Damon, what happens if you put a carrot in boiling water? And Damon thinks about it long and hard. He's like, carrot in boiling water? He says, it turns soft. He says, absolutely. He says, this boiling pot of water is going to heat you up so much that you may come out of this turning out real soft. Damon says, well, shoot, I don't want to turn soft. What's my next option? He says, Damon, what happens if you put an egg in the boiling water? Damon thinks about it long and hard, and he says, an egg in boiling water, it turns hard on the inside. He said, exactly right. You see, when Damon told me that, that's when I immediately thought back to that doctor who was super callous to everything that was going on around him and came and rushed himself and inserted himself into my family's grieving and separated us because for fear that, hey, I don't want you guys to contract COVID. You see, at that moment in time when I was back in that hospital room, I recognized that that doctor was treating me like a number. You see, at that time, he had experienced a lot of death. At that time, he had experienced a lot of sickness. And over time, what started to happen, he started to become callous to what was going on around him, and that doctor had turned into an egg. You see, I realized, I said, man, unfortunately in our profession, in law enforcement, that was my first glimpse at what a lot of police officers are, eggs. So going back to Damon, I said, well, Damon, well, shoot, if the egg was the second option, what was the third option? He says, that man told me that day in that jail cell, he says, Damon, what happens if you put a coffee bean in the boiling water? Damon thought about it long and hard. He starts to think, and he says, well, you put a coffee bean in the boiling water, it turns a pot of water into coffee. He says, absolutely. He says the coffee bean is the one thing that when put into the boiling water, pot of water, it actually changed the environment around it. It didn't allow the environment to change it. He says, Damon, if you do this right, you'll turn into a coffee bean. Keep in mind, I met Damon at a sushi restaurant in Dallas, Texas with Dak Prescott. After serving 7 years of his prison sentence, Damon turned into that coffee bean and was able to get out successfully, and now he travels around the country and the world doing what I do now. My friends, I'm here to tell you guys today that we are called to be different. We are called to be one percenters. We are called to go and show love, empathy, and respect to the people that we serve. And on that day in the hospital, I realized that if we allow our environment to change us, especially domestic violence or victims of domestic violence, they will experience exactly what I experienced that day when I was in the hospital. So who am I? My name is Ryan Tillman. I'm 35 years old. I'm from Southern California. I've been a police officer for a little over 10 years. And so I'm 35 years old. I have a wife and 3 children, and life has been good. And so when I was asked to come and talk about domestic violence, I hopped on a plane yesterday, and I'm getting ready, and a plane is what I found is that's like my only place of solitude. I feel so bad for my wife because she's so jealous of me. She has 3 young kids running around at home. Every time I call her, she's always upset with me. I'm like, dang, yeah, babe, I'm out here busy, babe. I'm grinding, honey. It's hard. Early nights, late nights, babe. I'm sorry. But really, realistically, I'm, sitting back, feet up, watching the movie on the plane. I'm like, oh, man, this is good. So yesterday, I'm flying out here. I'm like, man, what movie am I going to watch? So I start going through the new releases, and on the new releases, I came across a movie called Alice Darling. And I don't know if any of you guys have seen this. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. And the reason this movie was pretty significant, because as I'm reading the description, at the very end of it, what caught my eye, it said something about if you're the victim of domestic violence, call this hotline. I said, that's interesting. So I watched the movie Alice Darling, and this is Alice right here. She's the main character of the movie. And as I'm watching this movie, she is the victim of a domestic violence relationship. And I started to feel for her almost as if I was in the movie, because the things that her abuser was doing to her was completely despicable. What's even more interesting is he was doing all these things to her, and he hadn't laid one hand on her. He was manipulating her. He was verbally abusing her. He was doing all these different things, so much so that it was making her feel like she was next to nothing. She started doing all these different things in her relationships with her friends. She started secluding herself. She started thinking that, I'm a failure and I'm this and that. And I started feeling terrible because I started to imagine, what if that was my daughter? What if that was my mom? What if that was my wife? It was the saddest thing ever. And what I realized is that this lady, Alice, was on what we know as a domestic violence cycle of abuse. You see, she goes through this honeymoon phase with her spouse or her boyfriend, actually in the movie. They love life. They have good times. The movie actually starts by them having great times. They're going to dinner and they're doing all these different things together. And then some hostility starts to build and build and build and build. And as that hostility starts to build up, it comes to the incident where the actual domestic violence occurs. Whether it's verbal abuse, whether it's financial abuse, whether it's psychological abuse. The incident occurs. And then after that incident, it goes back to the repairing phase where they start to heal the relationship. And as this phase comes, her emotions start to go back up. Okay, we're gonna be okay. And then they get to this calm phase. Everything is fine, everything is good, until it's back on the hostility cycle. This is the domestic violence cycle of abuse. And as police officers, we see this all the time. And so much so that we start to turn into eggs and we start to become callous, because when we walk through the door, we're like, she keeps going back to this dude all the time. Why even put up with this? Why are you even putting up with this? We start to become eggs because unfortunately, sometimes in our profession, 95% of the times, we actually get to deal with most of the good people that are doing the right things in our community. 5% of our time is spent with the people that are doing 95% of the problems, 95% of the crimes. And what happens is over time, we start to view life through the lens of the 5% rather than the 95%. And when we're talking about domestic violence, that's exactly what happens. We start to look at these victims as people that are putting themselves in a situation and they have every opportunity to get out. But when you look at it behind the scenes, it changes things. Next slide, please. So today what I want to really focus on is if there's 3 principles, if you don't take anything away from today, there's 3 things that I want you guys to take away with how you live your life and how you do your job. Lead with love, lead with empathy, and lead with respect. It's simple. Sometimes we overcomplicate things. Sometimes we do all these different scientific studies. Will studies show this and studies show that? And it doesn't require all that. All it requires is a little bit of love, a little bit of empathy, and a little bit of respect. So let's start with love. What does that mean? You can go to the next slide. You see, a lot of times we believe that love has to be relational. And I'm here to tell you today that love doesn't need to be relational. In order to love somebody, you do not have to have a loving relationship with that person. You see, my dad, who passed away about a year ago from MS, he taught me a lot of valuable lessons as a kid. He would always say, Ryan, you need to love everybody like they're your mom, your brother, your sister, your cousin. He was like, if you do that, if you learn how to love people, I guarantee you'll have valuable relationships, but not only will you have valuable relationships, but it's gonna do something for you. And so I always stuck to that principle. So as we talk about domestic violence, when we walk into homes, if you start to have a different mindset of who you're talking to, if you start to love them like your brother, your sister, or your cousin, or your daughter, or whatever it may be, I guarantee you it's gonna give you a different approach on how you handle that situation. You see, that's what's gonna get you out of that cynical cycle of thinking that that person is putting themselves in that situation. You see, when you watch a movie like Alice Darling, it puts you in a situation and it makes you feel bad for the person because you see what happens behind closed doors. A little bit about me, I'm from Southern California and went to high school, Rialto High School. And after that, I went and graduated from there, went to college at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So I spent about 5 or 6 years of my life out in Vegas, which was one of the best times of my life, to say the least. And then I met my beautiful bride out there, and I moved back home once I met her after I graduated. And shortly after we got married, and she ended up becoming pregnant with our first child. So at the time I was working, I think at Abercrombie and Fitch, and I was doing insurance. And it was like the worst things ever. Like, I still think I'm gonna get cancer from all the perfume we sprayed or cologne we sprayed in the Abercrombie store, but that's neither here nor there. And so when my wife got pregnant, I had to start thinking about what other ways I can provide for my family, my new family, my growing family. And because insurance and Abercrombie wasn't going to cut it. So my dad's best friend was a captain for a police department. And he, for years, was like, hey, Ryan, you should become a police officer. And sadly, I was like, nope, I'm not doing that. I'm not working for the man. That was just my whole mentality, simply because growing up, I didn't really like police officers. I always thought cops were guys that got picked on in high school, so they became police officers so they could pick on everybody else. Like, that was my mentality. And so it wasn't going to be me. And so when your back is up against the wall and your wife is looking at you like, hey, you need to do something to provide for us, sometimes you start to venture out and to do different things in your life. So that's exactly what happened. I prayed about it and I asked God, hey, open the door for me. Show me what you want me to do. And the door for law enforcement just flew open, quite frankly. I applied for a few different agencies. And I literally, from the moment I put my first application in to the moment I got hired, was about 3 months, which was unheard of. And so I went to the police academy, graduated number 2 overall in my class, and went to work for the Chino Police Department, which has been nothing but a blessing. And I'm so glad that I actually followed God and his will for my life. Of course. So it started before the social media stuff. It was right around the time that when Ferguson went up in flames when Michael Brown was killed. And I never forget feeling ashamed of being a police officer for a minute, especially because as a black man, in our culture, it's not really, being the police is not something that we all strive to do. And so I almost felt ashamed for a little bit, but then I started thinking about it from a different perspective. And I realized, like,
a lot of people in our community don't understand why we do things as law enforcement officers. So I set out on a mission, and that's actually where my company, Breaking Barriers United, was started. I started out and said, I'm going to go out there into all the neighborhoods and really break down what it is that we do and why we do it and how we do it. So I started doing seminars in churches, and then from churches, I went to schools. From schools, I went to colleges, and it just kept evolving. But one thing that was kind of interesting was, I was doing all this work in my local neighborhood, in my community, but outside of my community, nobody really knew what else I was doing. And so fast forward, I met a really good friend of mine. He's become my media manager. His name is Billy. And Billy approached me and said, hey, I've been watching what you're doing from afar. I like what you're doing. I'd be interested in coming alongside of you and maybe helping you with some of your social media. So I said, let's do it. I hired him for 3 months. It was a risk that I took, but it was probably one of the best things that ever paid off. And we started creating social media content. And over time, it started evolving. And what it evolved into was me educating people of the why and the what when it comes to law enforcement. So I will do breakdowns of police videos. I will educate people by giving people Tillman tips. And then I just have good conversation. And it's funny, I met your husband at Brandon Tatum's event, and I was watching his videos long before I was doing the social media stuff. And I was telling him that his videos inspired me to kind of go out there and be a new age of education. And if you're listening to this and not familiar with what his videos were, he would make videos of breakdowns for police officers that we would watch in briefing settings. So anytime I would go 10-8, we would go to briefing, watch some of the videos, talk about how we can do things better as officers. And then I kind of had a light bulb moment. I was like, we should do the same thing, but do it for the community as well. So that way the community could understand why we did what we did. And so I've been doing that for almost 4 or 5 years now. And, the lid has just kind of been blown off. Yeah, sadly, sometimes people like to put law enforcement on a pedestal. And when they do that, they forget that we're human beings. They forget that we're going to make mistakes just like anybody else. I always tell people the number one most unpredictable thing in life, no matter what you compare it to, is human nature. Human nature is the most unpredictable thing in life. And so just because we have a badge and a gun on doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be perfect. And so what's happened is mainstream media is almost made it seem like a majority of law enforcement is bad and the whole system is just corrupt, when the reality is that a majority of law enforcement is good and a majority of officers are doing the right thing. But we do have some of those people that have made bad decisions or, not done the right things from a moral standpoint or ethical standpoint. So I realized early on, I said, in order for me to gain credibility amongst the community, especially the minority community, when it comes to law enforcement, I have to be willing to go out on a limb and call it bad when we do it. And it's tough because I'm a current police officer. And one of the things we always say in law enforcement is we shouldn't be Monday morning quarterbacking. And I agree with that to an extent, but at the same time, we also have to be able to acknowledge our wrongs. So that way, when we do get it right and it looks like it's wrong, people will be more apt to hearing what you have to say because they know that you're going to tell it one way or the other. There's so many other things that are killing us right now. The number 3 leading cause of death right now is medical malpractice. And without me going into it, medical malpractice is killing Black people more than anything right now. Traffic collisions are. Again, I talk about the statistics of actually what your odds of actually being killed by police officers are super small, very, very small. And here's the crazy thing about that is that when it comes to law enforcement and your interaction with them, for the most part, you kind of dictate the actions of the officer. So you can control what you can control when it comes to interactions with law enforcement. You can't do that when it comes to medical malpractice. You can't do that with car accidents. If you get in a car right now and somebody veers off and goes the opposite way of traffic, you're dead. No matter what you did, you can't control that. If you go into an operation room and you think you have the best doctor, but the medical doctor makes a mistake while you're under the knife, you can't control that. But when it comes to law enforcement interaction, you can control how that situation is going to go. You can cooperate with the officers, do what they tell you to do, put your hands in the air, don't make any sudden movements, be respectful, be kind. You can dictate the response that you're going to get from that officer, but we don't want to take accountability. And that's what we have to get down to. And so to answer the second part of that question is, where do we go from here? How do we improve this? As officers, we have to take it upon us to go out there and educate people about our profession. Sadly, people are afraid of the unknown. And so when you don't know why we do what we do and how we do what we do, you're just going to be you're going to be so influenced by going by what you see in the media or what your friends or family say that you go along with whatever they throw at you, even if it's false. And so we have to be better educating people, but at the same time, as community members, because I'm still a community member, we still got to be able to hold each other accountable. I probably take some criticism for what I'm about to say, but I'm gonna say it anyway because I've always said it. Is that I think right now is one of the best times to be a police officer, and obviously from the outside looking in, it's very difficult to be a police officer, and in that sense, it is one of the worst times to be a police officer because we're being attacked and criticized more than ever. But the reason I always say it's the best is because we have the opportunity to go out there and really change the profession for what it was meant to do in the first place. We have to acknowledge the past. We have to acknowledge that, law enforcement hasn't always been all great and dandy as we once perceived it to be. When you go back to the civil rights movement and you see, police officers that were a part of the KKK or standing up and at rallies, or you fast forward and you see, the corruption and the Rampart scandal. There is a lot of things, a lot of dirt that we've done in our profession. But now, with all eyes on us and everybody wanting law enforcement to get better, I tell people, like, if you want to find a solution to these problems, why don't you go out there and be the solution? And in order to be the solution, you got to become a police officer. There's no better way to shape the way and shape the future of law enforcement than by getting involved, becoming a police officer, understanding what we do and why we do it. So that way, it's not just me going out there and spreading this education. It's a whole bunch of me's going out there and spreading this education. So, my cousin said it best a long time ago, who's a successful entrepreneur. And he said, what, Ryan, a lot of times when people see a burning building, everybody starts to run away from it. But I kind of always look at life through the lens of, when I see that burning building, I'm running towards it and I'll wait for the firefighters to put it out, because once that building is, the fire is put out, you're now going to get that building at a discount. Nobody's going to want it because it's going to be all tarnished. But then now you can go in there and you can renovate the place, do it how you want to do it at a discount. And so that way, when you get the finished product, it's a much better building with a much firmer foundation than it was before. And that's kind of how I view our profession is I'm running towards it. I want to be able to make it better. I want to be a part of the reform as opposed to sitting on the sidelines. So that way, when I pass this over to our next generation, they have something better than I inherited.